Autumn of 1874. Nightfall lay heavy across the high plains of New Mexico territory, where the wind carried dust like ashes from some long-forgotten fire. The last light of the sun bled red against the horizon, painting the mesquite trees black, their branches scratching at the sky like broken claws. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the prairie grass bent under the cold breath of evening. On a stretch of land far from town, a lonely ranch stood against the emptiness. Its fences leaned, its barns sagged, and its owner moved like a shadow across the yard. Elijah Kane, tall, broad-shouldered, his beard gray with the weight of years, worked in silence, as he always had. Once, men had called him soldier. Once, he had a wife whose laughter filled these rooms. But time and loss had hollowed him out. Now he kept to himself, speaking only to the cattle and the wind that whipped through the desert. That night, as Elijah hauled water from the well, he froze. Something carried through the darkness, not the coyote's cry, not the restless stamp of horses, but softer, a human sound, faint, a groan, half-broken, as if torn from a throat that had nearly given up. Elijah set the bucket down and reached for his rifle. Lantern light swung across the yard, throwing his shadow tall against the barn wall. He followed the sound past the corral, boots crunching on hard earth, until he saw it just beyond the fence, lying in the dirt like a discarded rag doll. It was a girl, barely grown, her dress torn, her skin pale with dust and blood, her chest rising in shallow gasps. Elijah knelt, rough hands trembling against her fragile frame. For years, nothing had entered his world but silence and survival. Yet here she was alive, but hanging by a thread in his arms under the cold stars. And in that moment, he knew. The solitude he had built like a fortress around his life had just been broken. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The night the girl was found, Elijah Kane thought she wouldn't live to see the dawn. Her skin was fever hot, her breath thin as spider silk. He laid her on his bed, the same bed his wife once occupied, and sat through the long hours, dampening a cloth for her brow, listening to the wheeze of her lungs. Every so often her lips would twitch, as if words struggled to surface. He told himself he didn't care who she was or what trouble she carried. Come morning, he would take her into town and leave her to the doctor. Yet as the fire burned low, and her fragile hand caught his sleeve in her sleep, Elijah knew he had already stepped onto a path that would not release him. When the sun rose, pale gold across the desert, she opened her eyes. They were gray, storm-colored, the eyes of someone who had already seen too much. She tried to sit up, but the pain forced her back down. Elijah poured water into a tin cup and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, then whispered a name that wasn't his. He didn't press her. He only told her she was safe, at least for now. By midday, Elijah hitched his wagon and rode into town with her bundled under blankets. The town of Las Mesas was little more than a street of wooden fronts, a church spire, and a scattering of adobe houses. People turned their heads when they saw him. He had come so rarely in recent years that his presence alone was cause for whispers. But when they noticed the girl beside him, pale and wounded, the whispers sharpened. At the doctor's, Elijah laid her down and stood back while the old man examined her. The verdict was grim: exhaustion, dehydration, a broken rib, and bruises that told of violence. "She's been run hard, Kane," the doctor muttered, binding her side. "Someone wanted her dead. If you hadn't found her, she'd be there already." Vur. That should have been the end of it. Elijah could have left her in that room, paid his coin, and walked away. But when he turned to leave, the girl's hand shot out again, clutching at his coat like she had in the night. Her lips parted, and though her voice was ragged, the plea was unmistakable. "Don't leave me." He stood frozen. Every instinct screamed that she was not his problem. He had built his solitude like a wall against the world's demands, and here it was crumbling. Still, he nodded once and said quietly, "I'll see you back home." That evening, he carried her into his wagon again. She winced with every bump of the road, her small frame dwarfed by his worn coat draped over her. And with each mile between town and his ranch, Elijah felt the noose tightening. He had taken her under his roof, and by doing so, made her survival his burden. Days turned into a week. The girl's strength returned slowly. She moved about the cabin with careful steps, tending the fire, fetching water when Elijah wasn't looking. She gave her name only once, almost in a whisper, Sarah, no more. She guarded her story like a secret wound. Elijah didn't ask, but he watched the horizon with sharper eyes. Trouble didn't vanish out here. It followed. Sure enough, it wasn't long before men began asking questions in town. At the trading post, Elijah overheard them, two strangers in dust-coated coats, their voices low but sharp. They asked after a girl, described her age and figure, offered coin for any news. Elijah kept his head down, bought his supplies, and left. But he felt their gaze burning into his back as he mounted up. By the time he reached home, his mind was set. He loaded his Winchester and checked the locks on his barn. Sarah noticed the change in him and asked what was wrong, her eyes wide with fear. Elijah only told her this: "You're not safe yet, not out here, and neither am I." That night, as he sat by the fire with the rifle across his knees, the truth settled on him like the weight of the desert itself. He hadn't chosen this road. He hadn't invited this storm, but it had come all the same, and now he was bound to it. Elijah Kane, the man who once swore never to care again, was now guardian to a girl whose very presence drew death to his door. And the frontier was not a place that forgave such entanglements. The weeks that followed set tongues wagging from the saloon to the church steps. Elijah Kane had lived like a ghost for near a decade, and suddenly he was seen in town with a young woman under his roof. Folks didn't take kindly to mysteries on the frontier. Whispers carried faster than prairie fire, and before long, they grew into something meaner. At first, it was side glances and half-muttered words when Elijah rode in for supplies. A woman at the general store pulled her boy closer as Elijah passed. The blacksmith offered no greeting, only a steady stare at the girl standing shyly in the wagon. In Las Mesas, a place where every stranger's name was known by sundown, Sarah's silence unsettled people. They filled the gaps with suspicion. The preacher was the first to speak it aloud. One Sunday, his voice thundered from the pulpit. "The devil comes not in horns and shadow, but in guises we welcome to our table." A girl with no family, no past, fallen into the arms of a man who turned from his neighbors. What seed is planted in such darkness? The congregation listened with tight mouths and shifting eyes. No names were spoken, but everyone knew. By midweek, Elijah found his trade soured. The feed merchant refused to fill his order, claiming his stock was promised elsewhere. At the saloon, where once men would nod out of courtesy, he now felt their backs turning. One evening, a rancher he had fought beside in the war spat tobacco juice near his boots and muttered, "Careful who you shelter, Cain. Some burdens bring only blood." Elijah bore it with the same stoicism he carried into battle. He had never been a man of many words, and he had no use for defending himself to gossip. But Sarah felt the sting. She sat quiet on the wagon seat when they rode into town, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered. Once, when a group of women whispered openly on the boardwalk, she clutched Elijah's sleeve with trembling fingers. He said nothing, only laid a hand over hers, steady and firm. But it wasn't only talk. One night, Elijah found the fence posts near his pasture hacked clean through, his cattle scattered into the open plain. He spent hours rounding them back, the cold stars overhead, his breath white in the air. Another morning, he discovered a crude sign nailed to his gate: "Send her away, or share her fate." The threat didn't surprise him. He had smelled it on the wind from the first whisper. Still, he kept his rifle close, and his voice calm when Sarah asked if she was the cause of it all. "They don't understand," he told her, "and fear makes fools of men." Yet even Elijah could not keep the pressure from seeping into his bones. The town was his only lifeline for trade and tools. If the doors kept closing, survival itself would be tested. More than that, he saw the weight pressing on Sarah. Each cruel glance reminded her that she was a fugitive shadow, not a welcomed soul. Her silence grew heavier, and the haunted look in her eyes deepened. The breaking point came in broad daylight. Elijah was loading supplies outside the store when 3 ranch hands blocked his path. Their leader, a thick-necked man with whiskey on his breath, sneered, "Word is you're harboring stolen goods, Cain. And that girl, well, she ain't yours to keep." His hand drifted to the butt of his pistol, his grin daring Elijah to answer. The street went still. Men leaned on posts. Women peered from windows. The whole town waiting to see if the old soldier would bend or break. Elijah's jaw worked, the years of silence etched deep into his face. Then he lifted the crate into his wagon, turned, and spoke low enough that only the men could hear. "I buried better men than you. Out on fields where the earth still reeks of blood. Don't force me to make another grave." Something in his tone flat, weary, but certain made the ranch hand falter. The men stepped aside, and Elijah drove off without another word. But the message was clear. The frontier would not let him stand neutral. His choice had already been made the night Sarah awoke in his arms, and now the whole town knew it. From then on, Elijah Kane was no longer simply a recluse. He was a marked man, an outsider guarding a girl no one wanted, with enemies closing in like wolves around a wounded calf. Winter crept slowly across the plains, turning the mesquite trees brittle and the nights bitter cold. Snow dusted the far-off mountains, and a hard frost silvered the ranch fence lines each dawn. For Elijah Kane and the girl who called herself Sarah, the world outside had grown hostile. In town they met only suspicion. In the wilds the threat of men who hunted her still lingered. Yet within the walls of that weathered cabin, a different kind of silence began to settle. Not the lonely silence that had haunted Elijah for years, but a quiet filled with the rhythm of two lives, slowly learning to endure side by side. It began with small things. Elijah showed her how to mend tack, how to cut strips of rawhide and oil them against the dry air. She watched, hands awkward at first, then steadier, until the leather moved under her touch with practiced ease. In turn, Sarah took to the kitchen hearth, learning to stretch beans and cornmeal into meals that carried them through the cold nights. They spoke little, but their actions stitched together the fabric of survival. One evening, Elijah returned from gathering strays to find Sarah waiting with a lantern by the barn. She had spent the afternoon repairing a broken gate, her hands blistered but her eyes shining with pride. For the first time in years, Elijah felt a flicker of something close to gratitude, not for the work itself, but for the spirit that drove her to it. He nodded, and in his simple way, that nod said more than words could manage. As nights grew longer, the fire became their refuge. Sarah would sit with her knees drawn close, staring into the flames as if searching for shapes in the smoke. Bit by bit, pieces of her past slipped free. She spoke of a father who went west with promises of land and hope, but who never came back from a border skirmish. Of a wagon train attacked on the trail, the screams and gunfire still etched in her memory. She had run, she said, until her feet bled, until there was nowhere left to run. Elijah listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable. Yet when she faltered, when her voice broke, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder. No words of comfort, just presence, the kind of strength that doesn't need to be spoken. In time, Sarah turned the questions back to him. She asked about the war, about the medals gathering dust in the corner chest. Elijah spoke little, but enough. Of men who bled out under a burning sun, of orders that sent good soldiers to slaughter, and of the wife he buried one winter when fever swept the valley, leaving him with nothing but this land and his ghosts. The sharing was not grand or dramatic. It came in fragments, like water dripping from a cracked canteen, but each drop mattered. And in those exchanges, trust rooted itself, quiet and unshakable. There were lighter moments too, moments that crept up unannounced. The first time Sarah climbed onto a horse alone, she nearly toppled off, her laughter ringing against the canyon walls even as Elijah grumbled and reached to steady her. Another afternoon, she tried her hand at roping a calf and ended up tangled in her own loop, breathless with laughter, while Elijah shook his head, fighting the ghost of a smile. The bond between them wasn't born of romance or blood. It was something sterner, forged from hardship and the stubborn will to keep going. Sarah found in Elijah a shield, a man who would not abandon her to the wolves that circled. Elijah, in turn, found in Sarah a spark he had thought extinguished long ago, a reason to rise before dawn, a reason to build instead of simply endure. Still, the world beyond their ranch did not rest. At night, Elijah would sit on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. He knew the riders who sought Sarah had not given up, and in the town of Las Mesas, resentment still simmered. The walls of trust inside the cabin were strong, but outside, the winds of trouble gathered. For now, though, there was peace in the crackle of the fire and the slow mending of two wounded souls. Winter had made them lean on each other, and in that leaning they discovered a strength greater than either carried alone. But like all things in the West, quiet never lasted long, and as the first hints of spring thaw crept across the land, so too did the storm that would soon test everything they had built together. Spring broke over the New Mexico plains with a cruel mix of beauty and menace. Wildflowers painted the arroyos, and the rivers swelled with melted snow from the high country, but the winds carried dust storms fierce enough to strip paint from a wagon. For Elijah Kane, the season brought no peace. He had been waiting for the storm he knew would come not of nature, but of men. It began one evening when the sky burned red with sunset and the cattle bawled restless near the creek. Sarah was gathering wood when she spotted the smoke too heavy, too close, not from any homestead. By the time Elijah reached her side, he saw it too, a dark column rising from the north ridge, the kind only torches make. His stomach tightened. The hunters had found them. He moved quickly, boarding windows, stabling horses, setting rifles where they could be reached. Sarah watched him with wide eyes, fear clenching her hands around the hem of her dress. "We can run," she whispered, but Elijah shook his head. "Not fast enough. And this is the only ground we've got." Night fell, and with it came the riders. 6 of them, shadows on horseback, their torches burning like devil's eyes. They fanned out around the ranch, circling, whooping to rattle the cattle. One man called out, his voice dripping with menace, "Cain, send the girl out, and maybe we'll let you keep your skin." Elijah stood firm on the porch, rifle in hand, lantern light casting him in stark relief. "She's under my roof," he answered, voice low and steady. "That makes her mine to protect." The riders laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that promised blood. The first shot cracked the night, splintering wood near Elijah's head. He returned fire, the report of his Winchester echoing through the valley. Then the chaos began. Torches sailed through the air, striking the barn. Dry timbers caught instantly, flames climbing into the dark sky. Cattle screamed and stampeded through the broken fences, the earth trembling under their hooves. Sarah tried to haul buckets from the well, but Elijah pulled her back. "Inside," he barked, shoving her toward the cabin. The men were closing in, bullets shattering windows, glass raining across the floorboards. Elijah fired through the smoke, dropping one rider from his saddle, but the others pressed harder, their shadows darting in the firelight. The barn collapsed with a roar, sparks showering across the corral. Heat blasted the cabin walls, smoke choking the air. Sarah clutched a pistol Elijah had thrust into her hands, her knuckles white, eyes wide with terror. She had never fired at a man before, but when a figure burst through the doorway, she pulled the trigger. The blast echoed like thunder, and the rider staggered back, clutching his chest before falling into the dirt. The fight raged on, brutal and desperate. Elijah took a graze along the arm, blood soaking his sleeve, but he held his ground. His every movement was deliberate, a soldier once more, a man who had seen too much death to falter now. Yet for every rider driven off, another pressed forward. The flames leapt higher, devouring the corral, threatening the cabin itself. At last, silence fell broken, only by the crackle of fire and the frantic lowing of cattle scattered into the night. The riders, what few remained, had retreated into the darkness, leaving their dead in the dust. Elijah staggered against the doorframe, chest heaving, rifle barrel smoking. Sarah knelt beside him, tears streaking her soot-stained face. But the cost was plain. The barn was gone, the herd scattered, and the ranch a lifetime of toil lay in ruins. Elijah looked out over the smoldering wreckage, the glow of flames painting his weary features. For a long time he said nothing. Then, in a voice hoarse with smoke and sorrow, he muttered, "They came for her, but it's me they've destroyed." Sarah gripped his hand, her small fingers strong despite the trembling. "Then we'll rebuild," she said fiercely, the fire in her voice defying the ruin around them. Elijah turned his eyes to her, seeing not a burden now, but the only light left in a world darkened by flame. And though dawn had not yet come, they both knew the night had changed everything. The storm had broken, and nothing would ever be the same. The smoke lingered for days. Charred wood smoldered in the yard, and the acrid stench of burned hay clung to the air long after the flames had died. Elijah Kane stood amid the wreckage with his rifle still in hand, eyes fixed on the blackened skeleton of his barn. The fire had devoured more than timber. It had swallowed years of toil, the herd he had built, the security he had carved from barren earth. Yet as he turned, his gaze fell on Sarah, her face streaked with soot and tears but alive, standing firm at his side. That sight steadied him more than any wall of lumber ever had. For weeks afterward, the ranch was nothing but ruin. Neighbors rode past at a distance, their silhouettes cresting the horizon but never coming close. The whispers in town grew quieter now, not with kindness, but with unease. They had seen the fire, heard the shots, smelled the death on the wind. Yet Elijah and Sarah remained two stubborn souls refusing to be swept aside. Through the summer, the work of rebuilding began. Elijah's arm healed stiff but usable, and Sarah proved stronger than he ever imagined. Together they set fence posts in the heat, hammered nails into new beams, and slept on the cabin floor when exhaustion made their limbs too heavy to move. Sometimes they worked in silence, sometimes with small bursts of laughter that startled Elijah when he realized how long it had been since he'd heard such a sound. By autumn, the barn stood again, rough-hewn but sturdy, its beams carved with initials his and hers, a mark of survival, a sign that the storm had passed but not beaten them. The herd was smaller now, but calves grew fat in the corral, and crops sprouted in furrows Sarah had insisted on planting. At night, she sat by the fire, whittling a small piece of pine into a keepsake, a tiny horse, its shape rough but earnest. She set it on the mantel one evening, and Elijah said nothing, only stared at it with a heaviness in his chest he couldn't name. Winter came, hard and unrelenting, but it no longer pressed so cruelly upon the house. There were 2 pairs of hands to fetch water, 2 voices to break the silence, 2 lives leaning against each other when the wind howled across the plains. The bond that had been born in fear and blood was now something steadier, something like family, though neither dared speak the word. And then, as the year turned, something changed in the town of Las Mesas. When Elijah rode in for supplies, heads still turned, but not with malice. Men nodded curtly, as if acknowledging not just him, but the ordeal he had endured. A widow at the mercantile pressed extra flour into Sarah's hands, whispering only, "For the winter ahead." Even the preacher's fire had cooled. His sermons no longer spoke of curses, but of endurance and grace. The fire that had nearly ended them had also burned away the worst of the town's suspicion. One spring morning, a year to the day since the night of the riders, Elijah and Sarah stood at the rebuilt barn. The rising sun painted the beams gold, and Sarah reached up to touch the initials carved there. She slipped a silver chain from her neck, a trinket she had kept hidden all that time, a remnant of her father, and fastened it over one of the nails, letting it hang against the wood. "So it doesn't forget us," she whispered. Elijah watched her in silence, his face hard but his eyes soft, the smallest flicker of a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. Life had not returned to what it was before. It never could. The scars of fire and loss still lingered in every scorched patch of earth, in every memory that woke Elijah in the night. But there was something new now, a reason to rise, a reason to endure, a reason to rebuild when the world tried to tear him down. Sarah's laughter at the corral, the sight of her leading a horse with sure hands, the way she looked at him when the work was done, all of it reminded him that the frontier could take everything, but it could also give back what mattered most. Elijah Kane had once sworn never to care again, never to let another soul breach the solitude he had built like a fortress. Yet in the ashes of ruin, in the quiet strength of a girl who refused to be broken, he found himself caring more deeply than he thought a man could, and in that care, he found a measure of peace. As the camera of memory pulls back, the ranch stands steady against the horizon, once more barn rebuilt, fields green, smoke rising gentle from the chimney. 2 figures stand side by side, framed against the vast, endless sky. The world has not forgiven them, but it has bowed to their endurance. If this story touched your heart, Ride with us again, across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.